Day 1338 of the Ukrainian war map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 1,134,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 920 in the past day. Then as for hardware, 2 tanks, 6 APVs, 24 artillery, 1 air defense system, and another successful hit on an oil refinery, coming from yesterday morning's Ukrainian drone strike that ignited the Bottleneck refinery in Dagestan, which was then followed by a second strike overnight, and to mention shortly, making for a grand total of 2 on today's updated tally. Oh, and lastly to report for these stats updates, what looks to be one fresh unleashing of Storm Shadow cruise missiles against targets deeper inside Russian territory, with what looks to be the political will coming to bear, and coming as part of a rather immediate follow-up consolation gesture to Ukraine not receiving Tomahawks from the USA. And it looks like we may have already seen the results of that unleashing with yesterday's morning strike on the Bryansk chemical plant, as Ukraine's Air Force reportedly launched a combined assault using British/French Storm Shadow cruise missiles that broke through Russian air defenses and hit the facility, a producer of military-grade propellants for the Russian artillery, the rocket launchers, and cruise missile systems. The plant is located approximately 125 kilometers north of Ukraine's border, which is well within the scope of a Storm Shadow at 250 kilometers. And though these ranges are a walk in the park for your average UAV these days, there is a couple of notable differentiators to be had for the use of Storm Shadows. Firstly, being the 450 kilogram broach penetrator warhead, coming in at just under 1,000 pounds, designed for precision strikes on fortified or high-value targets. Then secondly, to note, is the cruise missile's low altitude and high velocity profile that makes it hard to detect and even harder to intercept. Now to head to the latest on the map, because indeed, it is Russian map activity time, with air raid sirens that blared as multiple blasts rocked the Plastmas plant in the Chelyabinsk region overnight, some 1,700 kilometers or 1,100 miles from Ukraine, with significant damage sustained to the facility, which is a defense-linked enterprise specializing in artillery shell manufacturing of various calibers, along with other various ordnance production. Some local reports indicate that blasts were caused by inbound UAVs that entered the airspace, which is a scenario that is consistent with the steadily increasing range and direction of Ukrainian drones observed in recent months, and even just weeks. In fact, Chelyabinsk, so far from the front, has not seen anything quite like this to date, apart from an internal sabotage incident against an Su-34 in January of this year, and then last week's air raid alert, but with no damage sustained, possibly a recon drone. It's the scale and the location of these latest blasts that are unprecedented for the region, previously unseen. This latest rumble may likely be linked to Ukraine's FP1 extended range drones, a system recently reported to have surpassed its typical 1,600 kilometer or 1,000 mile reach, enabling strikes deeper inside Russia's industrial heartland. Next up on the map, and to that most recent refinery hit, as Ryazan awoke to fire, as just after 2 a.m, the Skylines city lit up as explosions struck both the Rosneft refinery and its adjacent airbase, 2 keystones of Russia's fuel and strike bomber network. As for the refinery, this was a direct hit for a plant that is already operating at a significantly reduced capacity, due to previous inbound UAVs on the hunt, with overnight suggesting a sort of follow-up AFU maintenance strike. Yet, ironically, from Russia's POV, it instead has the tendency to mean an inability to perform maintenance and repair kind of strike. But either way it's looked at, it's no less serious an event. Even though Oblast Governor Malkov played down the incident, stating that debris from drones caused a fire at an industrial site, without confirming the refinery was hit, for a site that amounts to the 3rd largest refinery by capacity in the country. or at least by this stage, capacity once held. Now to the main map, into the center of hostilities, with reports on Ukrainian troops liberating Kushervar in the Donetsk region, raising the flag after a 2-month fight that saw more than 50 Russian soldiers surrender most recently on this part of the map. The village, once a minor feature on the map, had become a stubborn pocket along the northern rim of the Pokrovsk-Konstantinivka front. Sentinel imagery shows the assault came through forest belts from Vasil in the north, breaking Russian holdouts along the new Donbass line, which intersects along this active frontline region. So the latest advance here stabilizes the northern clay mine sector and reopens lateral routes feeding Ukrainian positions south of this sector. For Kyiv, the gain removes a persistent Russian salient that had constrained maneuver space and threatened local supply lines. For Moscow, it marks another attritional setback, a failed push meant to create leverage ahead of broader offensives, but now just about solidified as an embarrassing stalling of offensive momentum for their autumn advance operations. Now to adjacent Pokrovsk, with Russian pressure on the town, with Russian assault groups spotted near the city's western exit, along the highway to Dnipro, and near to the fortified Ukrainian base at the massive coal mine covering the city's western approaches. The grey zone has considerably widened in the past couple of days, with Russian attempts to consolidate all the way up to the E50 main road, known as the European route, but also known as the Defenders of Ukraine Street, a name that existed since before the full-scale SMO invasion began. Now, at a glance, it looks like half the town is captured, although switching to satellite view, a more realistic assessment shows 1/3 grey zoned or potentially 20% of the inhabited zone. Now, a head-on assault has always been difficult for the Russian army, which inevitably leads to the flanking approach by their forces. That's the gambit. So, in this case, to take Pokrovsk from the east-west has rather already been an approach taken by the invading army for some time. There's the Dobrapilla sector to the northeast, and long-time attempts to reach the main highway from the west near Kotlina. Ukraine's spokesman for the Kortitsia group has reported today on clashes in the southern micro-districts, and notes that Russians have abandoned their previous wave assault tactics due to manpower constraints, with no longer being able to throw unlimited personnel at the city in successive waves. So as for the new alternate reality, it's a shift from meat wave frontal assaults to infiltration tactics, sending multiple smaller groups of just a handful of soldiers to probe for weak spots as a means to gradually capture individual positions before reinforcing them. This means going on foot with only handheld weapons, deliberately accepting losses when hitting resistance, while doing everything possible to reinforce any breakthroughs in operations largely without heavy armor support. Now to the news, and where the United States has sanctioned Rosneft and Lukoil, Russia's two largest oil producers, after President Trump cancelled a scheduled Budapest summit with Vladimir Putin, thereby saving the Kremlin all that additional energy that goes into communicating their indefinite rounds of peace-stalling diplomacy. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said this latest sanctions move targets companies funding the Kremlin's war effort and warned of further actions if necessary. Trump framed the decision as a response to Putin's refusal to negotiate meaningfully, stating that talks with the Russian leader had been, quote, good conversations that didn't go anywhere, end quote. That refers to the 9 or so months of what has clearly been dead-end talks. Now, these sanctions hit companies together account for roughly 40% of Russia's crude output. Rosneft produces approximately 4.2 million barrels per day, and Lukoil around 1.6 million barrels per day. But this is where the additional sting comes in, as secondary sanctions exposure now applies to any entity transacting with the designated firms or their subsidiaries, creating compliance risk for importers in India, China, and Hungary. Rosneft alone supplies significant volumes to Indian refiners under a long-term contract, where those flows now require workarounds or face financial system exclusion. And as it so happens, and some of you will be aware, Lukoil operates a small retail network in the United States, primarily legacy stations in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, whose supply chains and branding may be restructured or divested to avoid sanctions entanglement. So this dual announcement marks the most aggressive US energy sanctions on Russia since the invasion began, directly targeting upstream production rather than downstream trading or services. Rosneft and Lukoil are both vertically integrated, controlling exploration, refining, and export infrastructure, so the latest sanctions designation forces counterparties to choose between Russian crude and access to dollar clearing systems. Overall, the timing coinciding with a cancelled summit signals that diplomacy has stalled and Washington is willing to escalate economic pressure as leverage. Prior sectoral sanctions left these companies partially operating through carve-outs and third-party intermediaries, but these latest actions close those gaps. Whether the combination shifts Kremlin calculations depends on enforcement rigor, such as secondary sanctions pressure against major Asian buyers. So the test here is now whether India and China accept financial system exclusion to maintain flows, or curtail purchases and force Moscow to either cut production or accept sharply lower netbacks. In fact, reports from just later today indicate China's state-owned oil companies have suspended purchases after Washington imposed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which also suggests refineries in India would intend to sharply reduce crude oil imports from Moscow to comply with US sanctions. But getting down to brass tacks, if secondary enforcement is credible and sustained, the hit to Russian export revenue, potentially an additional 40 billion euro annually at the current prices, could narrow its fiscal headroom to the degree that affects military spending. Then, also in news, and as mentioned, the US simultaneously lifted restrictions on Ukraine's use of Western-supplied long-range missiles to strike targets inside of Russia, a reversal aimed at intensifying pressure on Moscow without deploying American missile systems directly. The decision allows Kyiv to employ European origin systems, that is, Storm Shadows, as one such example, with President Trump emphasizing on the matter that there are not US missiles being fired into Russian territory. Beyond this, US officials confirmed the policy shift, stating it would allow Ukraine to intensify strikes and increase pressure on the Kremlin. The missile policy change redistributes operational risk to European allies, and a move that complements the economic pressure from the oil sanctions, creating a two-track pressure: financial isolation for Russian energy companies and expanded tactical options for Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, in EU news, updates from Brussels as all EU member states just backed sanctions package number 19 against Russia. Many of the proposals made the cut, with upcoming bans on Russian LNG imports and closure of refining loopholes for Russian crude processed in third countries. This will be effective as of January 2026, or just over 2 months away now. Time flies. Also for this latest package is the blacklisting of 118 additional tankers. Total now stands at 562, along with the ban on insurance services for these vessels. Also, and among other things, more export controls here, with a ban on EU exports of strategic goods equal to or above a value of 40 billion euros, which applies to Russia and third-party countries. For example, this includes minerals, rubber, and dual-use technology. So all up, the sanctions pressure on Russia is really clamping up now. And wouldn't you know it, EU sanctions package number 20 already underway. Then to a quick hardware news update. Sweden and Ukraine have signed a letter of intent for up to 150 Gripen E fighter jets, setting the stage for what could become Kyiv's largest air fleet purchase. President Zelensky said the first phase would include at least 100 aircraft, with Ukrainian pilots already trained and first operational use expected next year. Sweden's government described the deal as part of a broader long-term defense partnership, with an indication that older CD models could arrive sooner. For Ukraine, the Gripen's low operating cost and short runway capability would expand air defense resilience and complement incoming F-16s and Mirages, reinforcing its gradual shift toward a sustainable Western standard fleet. Then to head across to a cheap and nasty quick funny to round out the video today with, or perhaps more of a lighter segment. As defenders from Ukraine's 72nd Brigade finally received their new dragon costume, and they had a bit too much fun filming this one. Even on the front lines, Ukrainians know how to keep their spirits alive. Laughter and creativity are a part of the resilience that makes the warriors' morale unstoppable. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment. Thanks once again for all of the support. As a quick note, these videos are now taking me a little bit longer than the allotted amount of time per day, which means it's led to a few extra skipped days here and there, but I'm not a quitter, nothing like that. Instead, using all the additional non-upload days, spare time to remanage workflows, make things more efficient on the back end, and absolutely adamant that I will get to a 7-day-a-week upload pace. So thanks again for watching, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!